Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 151. The Philanthropist. After Walter Russell Hall died in October 1911, his gift to charity was outlined in the Victorian papers, a staggering £1 million. I was intrigued to find out how he made his fortune and why he bequeathed so much to charity, and if any family members also benefited. Walter Russell Hall was born on the 20th of February 1831 in Herefordshire, England. He was the second child of 9 children born to Walter Hall and Elizabeth Carlton Scarrett. Walter Hall Sr. was born in 1798 and married Elizabeth Scarrett in 1828 in Kington, Hereford, England. Walter was a glover and later a miller. In the 1850s, industrialisation caused seismic change across Britain. William Hall Sr. may have felt his skills would become redundant, and this might have been the impetus for the struggling Hall family to join the wave of immigrants to take their chance on a new life in a new land, making the journey to Australia. His father, William Sr., died on the 8th of May 1857, and his death was announced in the paper at Wallerley House, West Maitland, much regretted by all who knew him, Mr. Walter Hall, aged 59 years, late of Kington, Herefordshire, England, and his wife Elizabeth died in Sydney in 1864. Young Walter was educated at Kington and Taunton in Somerset, and as a young man of 21, Walter migrated to New South Wales, arriving on the 14th of February 1852 with only a few pounds in his pocket and grand dreams. He was accompanied by 2 of his younger brothers, Thomas Scarrett Hall and James Wesley Hall. His parents hadn't emigrated by this point. He found employment as a clerk with David Jones Limited, and by 1854 made his way to the Ballarat gold diggings, then to the Bendigo and Ovens goldfields, but he only had meagre success. It says that he took up his residence in Victoria, but was quickly attracted from the more sedate lines of business by the rush to the gold diggings at Ballarat. Here he took a prominent part in the opposition that was raised by the miners to the action of the government in seeking to introduce mining licences. He was one of the very few survivors of the Eureka Stockade riot, one of the most thrilling events in the history of Australia. However, there are other sources that say that Walter was not involved in the Eureka Stockade at all, so there's a little bit of contradictory information regarding that. So he realised that prospecting was not for him, so he decided to set up in business. He started a store and, for a time, a carrying service between Ballarat and Melbourne, and then he became an agent for Cobb & Co. at Woods Point. Together with James Rutherford in 1861, he purchased Cobb & Co., the horse-drawn coach line of Australian history and tradition. He later acted as its Sydney agent, travelling extensively in New South Wales and Queensland to open up new lines and make inspections. He left the firm in the mid-1880s. He married Eliza Kirk, the eldest daughter of George Kirk, a Yorkshire butcher, and his wife Elizabeth Whipple from Devon, on the 15th of April 1874 at St Paul's Church of England, which is now the Anglican Cathedral in Melbourne, and they settled in Sydney. By this time, Walter was already a comparatively wealthy man. George Kirk, after engaging in various pursuits, had acquired large pastoral interests in partnership with Richard Goldsborough and represented East Burke in the Legislative Assembly of Victoria in 1861 to 1864. George Kirk built his family a gracious Gothic revival home they called Avoca on the banks of Yarra. George Kirk has an interesting story of his own, so I have done a bonus episode on him and his family. On the 15th of May 1876, it says that notice is hereby given that the partnership existing between the undersigned as coach proprietors and station holders under the style of Cobb & Co. has been dissolved by mutual consent, that the said business and all of its branches in New South Wales and Queensland will be carried on in the future by James Rutherford, Walter Russell Hall and William Franklin Whitney. So basically they had 5 men that were all partners in the Cobb & Co business in 1876, and 2 of the men had relinquished their partnership in it, leaving 3 behind. In 1882, Hall was approached by his brother Thomas, who was the manager of the Rockhampton branch of the Queensland National Bank, to invite him to join a syndicate formed to develop the ironstone mine that mined both gold and copper. Hall accepted the invitation, and Hall and his associates resisted 9 attempts for people to jump their claim. 2 they needed to take right up to the Privy Council. So a syndicate was created to open the gold mine. Ironstone Mountain was 39 kilometres south of Rockhampton in Queensland. The syndicate comprised of William Knox Darcy, who I've also done a bonus episode on, Walter Russell Hall, Thomas Scarrett Hall, Thomas Frederick and Edward Morgan, and William Patterson, a local grazier, whose daughter married Walter's brother, William Baines Hall. After they created their syndicate, they renamed it Mount Morgan after the Morgan members of the syndicate. The Morgan brothers eventually sold their shares to the remaining members of the syndicate, apparently having no faith in the life of the mine at that time. However, 4 years later, on the 1st of October 1886, the Mount Morgan Gold Mining Company Limited, with a capital of $1 million, was registered in Queensland. The mine yielded gold and copper worth over $19 million and paid $8 million in dividends by 1913. Walter was a major shareholder, a director of the company and chairman of the Sydney board. James Wesley Hall, the younger brother, was the first general manager of the mine. By 1907, the mine had produced $60 million worth of gold, making it one of the richest gold mines in the world. In 1887, Walter and Eliza Hall visited England and remained away for over a year. Walter was also a director of the Mercantile Mutual Insurance Company Limited, the Sydney Meat Preserving Company Limited, and the Electrolytic Refining and Smelting Company. He also acquired substantial holdings in the booming pastoral industry. They purchased Wildfell, a home at Potts Point in Sydney, a large 2-storied house with a garden extending to the water. Eliza, who loved good jewellery, filled the house and her Melbourne residence with landscapes and portraits, bronzes, marble statues, china and glass. In a large entrance hall lived an enormous, colourful Brazilian macaw and a chatty cockatoo. In an article in the Sydney Morning Herald, Eliza stated that she loved to drive in her carriage in the morning and her motor car in the afternoon, and she was very fond of flowers, and her favourite drive was around Centennial Park, where all the gardeners know her. She was a gentle lady with simple but refined tastes. While Walter was an astute businessman, there is no doubt that Eliza and Walter worked as a team. Her sister-in-law's diaries give the impression that Eliza was a woman to be obeyed, but certainly not to be ignored. She accompanied her husband on many long, uncomfortable journeys to Melbourne and to the Queensland mine. Walter and Eliza didn't have children, however she undertook the care of 2 young orphan cousins, sent them to boarding schools, and on the holidays made them feel welcome at Wildfell. Both Walter and Eliza were active philanthropists during their life together. Whilst Walter never attempted to make a splash in Sydney society, and they did not entertain lavishly, and he was regarded as rather mean in this regard, but he liked to give the boys a good time on his annual visits to Mount Morgan that continued till 1910. He welcomed employees at dinners and held convivial gatherings, and also entertained the Mount Morgan children, in whom he took a great interest. In this era in Australia, acts of philanthropy by the wealthy was still fairly rare, although this was slowly changing. The couple generally made small regular donations to a range of causes, quietly and unostentatiously. Walter gave generously to the Mount Morgan educational and other institutions. And when in Sydney, Hall seldom missed a race meeting. He was a committee member of the Australian Jockey Club in 1873 through to 1911. His horses included the Sydney winners Garfield, Delaware and Reviver. When Reviver won the Metropolitan in 1900, Hall anonymously gave £1,000 to charities. He was also engaged in coursing. And they also helped individuals as well as public institutions. Many of the benefactors were anonymous, but he did give £5,000 to the Patriotic Fund during the Boer War and £10,000 that he gave to the Dreadnought Fund. And it was said that Mr. Hall was a man of sound judgment and strongly marked personality. Remarkably gifted as a judge of character and in recognising the qualifications of those associated with him in business affairs. In matters of a charitable nature he was liberal, and as a citizen he recognised and discharged his obligations and responsibilities to the Empire. Walter passed away, aged 80 years, on the 13th of October 1911 at his home, Windfell, at Potts Point. He was buried in the Melbourne General Cemetery in Victoria, and his estate was valued for probate at £2,915,513, his principal beneficiary being his wife Eliza. His obituary reads, "The death of Walter Russell Hall of Winfield, Potts Point, takes from us one more of the fast diminishing band of sturdy pioneers who came to Australia in the early 50s in search of the Golden Fleece." The late Mr. Hall, after a few years of gold digging at the great historic finds of Victoria, with varying success, settled down as one of the pioneers of transportation of those early days. He soon became the leading proprietor of Cobb & Co, and by his energy, capacity and foresight, acquired what was considered in the early 70s a large fortune. Then his brother Tom acquired from the Morgans a controlling interest in the Mount Morgan mine, which turned out to be one of, if not the richest, gold producer the world had then seen. Tom Hall took Walter and others with him in this venture, and from that time onwards great riches flowed onto the Halls. Walter Hall, though, loved Melbourne and its old associations and often visited it, but he made Sydney his home. Of late, however, increasing age kept him from leaving Sydney. His death creates a great gap in that city, where he was well known and well liked by all classes. At various times he contributed large sums to public uses, and his own and his wife's private benefactions were numerous and constant. He was a good sportsman, identified with coursing in its early days and always with racing. He was a member of the committee of the Australian Jockey Club almost continuously for 45 years right up to his death. He's known to amass great wealth, and it's understood he has left very handsome bequests to charities in New South Wales and Queensland. Only 10 days prior to his death, he was present at Randwick and greatly enjoyed meeting his old friends. He leaves a widow but no children. On the 25th of May 1912, an article titled Australian Millionaire, "The magnificent gift of £1 million to charity by the widow of the late Mr. Walter Russell Hall recalls reminiscences of the extraordinarily successful career which fell to the lot of the testator, who, starting in Melbourne in 1852, in a humble sphere of life, accumulated before its close no less than £2,311,000. He was a native of a small village in Herefordshire, England, and arrived in Victoria early in 1852. He afterwards married Miss Kirk, daughter of the late Mr. George Kirk, a Victorian pastoralist, and niece of Mr. Kirk of the well-known Kirk's Bazaar, Melbourne. So, as mentioned, in the year following her husband's death, Eliza set up a charitable trust with a donation of £1 million, and it was named the Walter and Eliza Hall Trust. She brought retired British and Australian Major General Harry Finn out from England to become secretary of the trust. On her instructions, the trust deed of the Walter and Eliza Hall Trust was drawn with Richard Gardner Casey, Sir John French, Sir George Kelso King and Sir Adrian Knox as the original trustees. Its terms were made public on Empire Day, the 24th of May 1912, and it came into operation on the 1st of January 1913. Half of the income was to be spent in New South Wales, the state in which Hall made his first wealth, 1/4 in Queensland, where he had greatly increased it, and 1/4 in Victoria, his widow's home state. It was to be used for the relief of poverty, the advancement of education, the advancement of religion in according with the tenets of the Church of England, and for the general benefit of the community, not falling under the preceding headings. As far as was practicable, 1/3 of the income in each state was to be used for the benefit of women and children. Many individuals have benefited from the trust, not least those who obtained postgraduate travelling and research fellowships. Some have had distinguished careers and made valuable contributions to the Australian community. A large part of Victoria's share of the trust funds was spent in establishing in 1916 the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Research in Pathology and Medicine in Melbourne. Eliza Hall was a diabetic, and she died of cancer at Wildfell on the 14th of February 1916 and was buried beside her husband in the Melbourne General Cemetery. Her estate in 3 states was valued for probate at £1,180,059. In her detailed will, she left generous bequests and annuities to her own and her husband's numerous relations, to friends and to servants. Her large collection of jewellery was divided among her female relatives, and she left some pictures and statues to the Melbourne and Sydney art galleries. An article announcing her death in the paper on the 15th of February 1916. Death of Mrs. Walter Russell Hall. Mrs. Walter Russell Hall died at her residence, Potts Point, this morning. She had been in feeble health for 8 months. A sudden change took place on Sunday morning where she fell into an unconscious condition and never rallied. In the early days, when the Australian Railways mileage was short and the means of approach between centres of civilisation were comparatively slow and cumbersome, Mrs. Hall often travelled from Sydney to Melbourne with her husband in a buggy. The name of Mrs. Hall, in conjunction with that of her husband, will always be identified with the Walter and Elizabeth Hall Trust. In her life, Mrs. Hall has given practical evidence of her large-hearted benevolence, and when, on the death of her husband, she acquired great wealth, she sought competent advice on how best she could devote a large part of it for the benefit and relief of her fellow citizens in the Australian states in which she and her husband have been closely connected. A stained glass window and tablet commemorate Walter and Eliza Hall in St Paul's Cathedral, Melbourne. And on the 22nd of March 1919, it was announced in the paper that the memorials in the form of a stained glass window and brass tablet were dedicated by Archbishop Clarke in St Paul's Cathedral today to the memory of the late Mr Walter Hall and his wife, Mrs Eliza Hall. Archbishop Clarke said it was a great and noble gesture and a fine expression of responsibility for the right use of great wealth. Their portraits by Frederick McCubbin are on loan to the Walter and Eliza Institute of Medical Research, and another portrait of Mrs Walter Hall by McCubbin is held by the National Gallery of Victoria, and marble busts of both by Bertram McKennell were given to the Institute by the Art Gallery of New South Wales. The locality of Walter Hall, beside the Mount Morgan mine in central Queensland, was named after him. Walter's siblings. Elizabeth Ricketts Hall was born on the 18th of May 1829 in Kington, Hereford, England. She did not marry, and she died on the 7th of December 1878 at St George, New South Wales, aged only 49, and she's buried with her sister Mary. And it's stated that she died at Rowland Cottage, Petersham. The second sibling, Mary Ann Hall, was born on the 3rd of April 1833 at Kington, Herefordshire, England. She emigrated in 1853. She did not marry, and Mary died on the 15th of November 1870 in New South Wales, aged only 37, from tuberculosis that she had been suffering from for 13 years. And she died at the residence Miles Building in Cumberland Street, Sydney. And as mentioned, she's buried with her sister Elizabeth. The third sibling was Susanna Price Hall, who was born on the 15th of January 1835 at Kington, Herefordshire, England. She died in 1853 at Plymouth, Devon, England, aged only 18. The fourth sibling, Thomas Scarrett Hall, was born on the 6th of December 1836 at Kington, Herefordshire, England. He migrated to Australia in 1854, moved to Rockhampton in 1863 and took up a position as an accountant at the local Australian Joint Stock Bank. From there he went to Clermont to manage the bank's business, but came back to Rockhampton early in 1866 to manage the Rockhampton branch. Some years after, he was transferred to Goulburn, New South Wales. Thomas was one of the original owners of the Mount Morgan mine. He was the first chairman of the Mount Morgan Company and served as one of its directors since its founding. He married Jane Kirk on the 18th of January 1887 in Kyneton, Victoria, when he was 55 and Jane 30. Jane had been born in Kyneton and they had 3 children. Following his retirement in 1887, they lived for a time in Melbourne. In 1888, he donated a parcel of 12 acres of parkland to his hometown of Kington as a charitable trust to be used as a recreational ground. The family moved to England in about 1890. He purchased Weeting Hall in Weeting, Norfolk, in early 1899 as a country estate and did many renovations there. Thomas visited Rockhampton in 1900 and he died on the 14th of June 1903, aged 66, in London. Thomas is buried in a tomb in East Finchley Cemetery in the City of London. It's a grey and pink granite tomb built on an island and is said to be modelled upon Napoleon's tomb in Paris. His tomb is listed on the National Heritage List. Jane died on the 8th of July 1943 at Chard, Somerset, England. Thomas's family continued to live at Weeting Hall until 1927. Their children, Harold Wesley Hall, was born on the 27th of November 1888 at South Yarra, Victoria. He married Doris Goodall Clegg in Surrey, England in August 1914 and enlisted in World War I in 1915. They had no children. In July 1924, he arrived in San Francisco from Tahiti, saying he was staying in the US for 50 days. In 1859, he travelled from New York to London on the Queen Elizabeth. Harold died in June 1974 at New Forest, Hampshire, England, aged 85. Their second child, Walter Darcy Hall, was born on the 10th of August 1891 in South Yarra, Victoria. He was educated at Eton College. From 1914 to 1929, he was a Conservative Member of Parliament in England, and he served in World War I from 1914 to 1918 and was a captain in the 20th Hussars. He served through the war and gained the Military Cross and the Croix de Guerre and 2 bars. He married Anne Madeline Brooke in London in 1920 when he was 28 and Anne was 20, and they had 3 children. In 1930, the family did a West Indies round trip on the Alcantara. One of their sons, Darcy William Hall, was killed in action in World War II in Italy. He was in the Irish Guards. Another son, Edward Thomas Hall, was a professor of archaeology. And Walter died in 1980 at Salisbury, Wiltshire, England. And another of Thomas's children was Athelstan Argyle Hall, who was born on the 9th of March 1894 at South Yarra, Victoria. He was a boarder at Bournemouth School and also attended Eton College. He became a second lieutenant in the Western Cable Signal Company on the 5th of September 1914. By the December, he became a temporary second lieutenant in the Royal Engineers Territorial Force. He then rejoined the Royal Signals when it was realised he was a skillful radio amateur. He was put in charge of the area of the Radio Security Service, also called the Y-Intercept, based at Barnet, and this comprised of a number of voluntary interceptors listening nightly to German military transmissions from their homes in East Anglia. Their logs were collated and sent by a dispatch rider to Bletchley Park, where they were decoded. 1 week after the armistice in 1918, Athelstan filed a patent for improvements in or relating to wireless signalling apparatus, and this was granted on the 18th of May 1920. In November 1923, he sailed with his mother to Quebec, Canada, and in 1927 he married Nancy Armitage Dyson in London. Athelstan was 33 and Nancy 26. In December 1929 he sailed to Argentina, and in February 1932 sailed to Gibraltar, and in 1937 went on a cruise. In 1939 they lived at Westport Lodge in Chard, Somerset, and moved to Cricket House in 1943 after his mother Jane Hall died. Athelstan died on the 2nd of March 1963 at Cyprus, Greece, aged 68. There is a memorial in Cricket Street, Thomas Church, to Athelstan, as he was the church warden for over 40 years, and he was also a county councillor. Another sibling, James Wesley Hall, was born on the 22nd of February 1839 in Kinton, Herefordshire, England. He married Dora Frederica Mary Dempster in Victoria in 1889 when he was 50 and Dora 25. They had 3 daughters, and Dora died on the 23rd of November 1895 at the age of only 31. James then married Dora's sister-in-law, Margaret K. Lillian Dempster, known as Daisy, in December 1898 when he was 59 and Daisy 26. They married at Omar, Boundary Road, Toorak, which was James's residence, and it stated that Daisy's father, William Dempster, lived at Stratford in Toorak. An article in December 1898 says that Mrs. James Wesley Hall, who has only just returned from their honeymoon trip, is already taking an active part in various schemes of Toorak society to help others less fortunate than themselves, and her cheque was received with others for Miss Sterling's testimonial concert. It is easily assumed that Mrs. James Wesley Hall will soon be recognised as one of the most popular young lady matrons. James died on the 7th of January 1901, so only 3 years after they married, at the age of 61. And his obituary reads, "The late Mr. James Wesley Hall, who died at Toorak on Monday night, was the original manager and one of the original shareholders in the Great Mount Morgan Mine, Queensland, and a notable man. He was born at Kingston, Herefordshire in 1839. Coming to Australia over 40 years ago with his 2 brothers, he gained his knowledge of mining and mining engineering at Sydney University. He was engaged for many years in tin mining in the New England district of New South Wales, and altogether his mining career extended over more than 30 years. At the time of the discovery of the famous Mount Morgan mine, his brothers, who were financially interested, sent him to manage it, and while acting as manager, he invented the celebrated dry chlorination process, which is in operation on the property now, a process of which the late Mr. Wesley Hall held the Queensland patent. When he started managing the mine, he erected 5 head of stampers. Now the mine employs over 2,000 men and has an output of £1 million per annum. In his personal character, the late Mr. Wesley Hall was a very lovable man, and his kindnesses are unnumbered, as they are unknown, for he was one of those rare men who do good by stealth and blush to find it fame. He was practically the provider of the charities in Mount Morgan and district. While Melbourne came in for a considerable share of the large amount of money, he only devoted to deserving objects. Mr. Wesley Hall was twice married and leaves 3 daughters by his first wife and a widow. He was a director of Goldsborough Morton Co. and a member of the Old Colonists Association, to whose funds he liberally contributed. He retired from active management of the company some 8 years ago and visited England, and on his return he took up residence in Melbourne. Mr. Walter R. Hall of Wildfell, Potts Point, and Mr. T. S. Hall of London were brothers of the deceased. And it outlined the funeral of James. The funeral of James Wesley Hall was attended by a very large number of the deceased gentleman's friends on Thursday in Melbourne. In private life, Mr. Hall was very quiet and unostentatious. No stranger would have suspected the existence of his wealth from a casual meeting with him, but he was nevertheless a most generous supporter of charitable objects. He was a large and consistent subscriber to public charities, though he would never allow his name to appear, and when the Queensland's Bushmen's contingent was raised, he contributed £300 anonymously to the funds. His private benefactions were even larger and more secret, for Mr. Hall would go to great pains to prevent the source of his gifts being traced. And on the 9th of March 1901, mentions 2 big wills. One of them was Charles Carlton Scarrett, who was actually the brother-in-law of Walter Russell Hall, and James Wesley Hall. So these men died very close to one another. So in terms of the will of James Wesley Hall, he had £67,010, and it says that there were no bequests made to charities or for public purposes in the will. The trustees of the Hall estate are Walter Russell Hall of Sydney, so his brother, Kelso King of Sydney, and Arthur Frederick Hooper of Toorak. To each of them £1,000 is bequeathed, free of legacy duty. The trustees, together with the testator's widow, Margaret Kate Lillian Hall, are constituted guardians of the children that are under age. To the widow, bequeathed all articles of personal or domestic use or household ornament with a legacy of £10,000 and an annuity of £2,000, free from the control or disposition of any husband should she marry again. Louise Sarah, widow of Albert Henry of Somersetshire, England, for a legacy of £2,000, and Alfred Cadell of Emmaville, the testator's mining interests in New England and Grafton districts. He gave his sisters-in-law 1,000 shares each in the Mount Morgan Gold Mining Company. To his cousin, Thomas Carlton Scarrett, a legacy of £500. To George Richards of Mount Morgan, £2,000. To Thomas Corner, also of Mount Morgan, £500. And to his uncle, Thomas Carlton Scarrett of Kington, Herefordshire, England, an annuity of £200. And out of the residuary estate, the trustees are directed to pay the testator's widow any sum of up to £1,000 a year for the maintenance and education of each of the children under age or unmarried. The trustees to have the power to increase such allowances under special circumstances. As part of the proceeds from his estate, in October 1903, in the Government Gazette, it states that James Wesley Hall had a conditional purchase in the Chower Parish, Walkill County, near Deniliquin, so around 550 acres all up. On the 27th of September 1918, it says cable advice has been received by Mr. A.F. Hooper of the death following on a paralytic stroke of Mrs. Wesley Hall, widow of the late James Wesley Hall of Mount Morgan. Mrs. Wesley Hall had lived in England for the last 10 years. She was a very active worker and generous contributor in regard to different war funds. For her services as Honorary Secretary of the Belgian Refugee Food Fund, an organisation which has done notable relief work in London, she had the Queen Elizabeth Medal conferred to her by King Albert of Belgium. So James's children. Mary Elizabeth Wesley Hall was born in Williamstown, Victoria on the 19th of May 1890. So she was 11 when her father died. She married Joseph Harker Boy de Morzilli St. Mars at St. George's in Hanover Square, London in July 1915 when she was 25 and Joseph 41. On the 15th of May 1928, in a Melbourne paper, it says Toorak woman hunted lions in the Congo. Mr. J. D. Monzile de St. Mars reached Melbourne by the Nakunda yesterday after hunting big game with his wife in the heart of the Congo. Madame de St. Mars travelled with her husband and 100 bearers through a large tract of Central Africa and assisted to kill lions, elephants and buffaloes. My wife, he says, shared all the dangers with me, holding my second rifle. Her coolness and nerve were wonderful. Madame de St. Mars was born in Toorak, the daughter of the late Mr. James Wesley Hall of Mount Morgan, and a niece of Mrs. Walter Hall of Sydney. She has not been in Melbourne for 20 years and lives with her husband in England. They are here on holiday and plan to go to New Zealand for fishing and game hunting. In 1930, they're listed as sailing to Cape Town, South Africa from England, and also arriving in Montana, USA in September 1930. And she's with her husband and her sister Georgina, and it's stated that their usual residence was France. She also arrived in the USA from her residence in France with Madame Duvaudet in 1934, and in 1937 sailed from New York to California. In 1940, they were living at Pasadena, Los Angeles, California, as well as owning a home in London. And Joseph died at Pasadena on the 25th of February 1942 at the age of 67. In 1945, Mary is listed as living at Chippenham Park, Cambridgeshire, England. And Mary died on the 22nd of February 1982 at Kensington, England at the age of 91. They had no children. Her sister, Dora Mary Ann Wesley Hall, was born in Williamstown on the 5th of December 1891. She married in London in 1913, and an article outlining this says a London wedding. Many in Australia will be interested to read of the recent marriage in London of Miss Dora Wesley Hall, second daughter of the late James Wesley Hall of Melbourne, and stepdaughter of Mrs. Wesley Hall of Berkeley House, London West, with Major Honorary George Morris of the Irish Guards, son of the late Lord Morris and Killarney. The ceremony took place in the Westminster Cathedral in England, which, in honour of the event, was beautifully decorated with groups of palms and tall baskets of Madonna lilies. The aisle was lined with NCOs and men of the bridegroom's regiment. The bride, who was given away by her stepmother, entered the church on the arm of her cousin, Colonel Frank Dawson. Lord Killarney, brother of the bridegroom, was best man. Lord Arthur Hay and the Honorary A.G. Mulholland acted as ushers. They had a son, Michael, on the 20th of July 1914 at St George Hanover Square, Mayfair, Middlesex, England. And unfortunately, George Henry Morris was killed while serving in the war. Commanding officer killed. The War Office casualty reports include a list of killed in action. Lieutenant Colonel, the Honorary George Henry Morris, commanding the 1st Battalion of the Scots Guards, died in November. He only married last year. On the 27th of September 1927, it announced, following the death last month of Lord Killarney, son of Michael Morris, the famous Irish judge, who was the first Baron Killarney, the title falls to his nephew, Michael Morris, who was aged 13 years. The father of the boy, Pierre, was Lieutenant Colonel George Morris, who was killed in battle in 1914. So in the Australian Woman's Weekly on the 16th of November 1977, there was an article titled The Many Lives of Lord Killarney. World Olympic chief Lord Killarney, a man with so wide a range of enthusiasms he can't wait to retire to indulge them all, is zestfully researching his Australian ancestry for his autobiography. His mother was Dora Mary Wesley Hall of Toorak, Melbourne, and her father James Wesley Hall mined at Mount Morgan. Lord Killarney, an Irish writer, sportsman, company director, former film producer, arrives in Australia with his wife Sheila on the 14th of November on a business and pleasure trip. His only other visit was for the Melbourne Olympics in 1956 as president of the Irish Olympic Council. He became president of the International Olympic Committee in 1972 and steered the Games through two of the most troubled series, Munich and Montreal. Now he's working towards the Moscow Games in 1980. His films included The Quiet Man, The Playboy of the Western World, and at home there are many movie stills and happy family snaps from the woman he knew as Grace Kelly. He is Monaco's honorary consul general in Dublin. His son Redmond Morris, 30, is an assistant film director working on Agatha, the story of Agatha Christie. Deborah, 27, is a theatrical artist and married to William Bryden, the director of Britain's National Theatre. They have twins that are 26 at the time of this article, John, a freelance photographer in Dublin, and Michael, a steeplechase jockey who won last year's Irish Grand National. Lord Killernan inherited the title in 1927. It was created for his grandfather, the first Roman Catholic Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. After Eton, then Salburn and Cambridge, he was a journalist on the London Express and Daily Mail, and is still a member of the Irish National Union of Journalists. In the International Olympic Committee, he has swept a refreshingly clean broom. His wife, who was Sheila Dunlop, met at the Galway races, and he stated that his parents also met at the races. Michael died in Ireland in April 1999. After the death of her husband, Dora married Gerard Prideaux Tharp on the 12th of March 1918 at St James's in Piccadilly, London, when she was 26 and Gerard 48. They had a girl and a boy. Helena did not marry, and the son, John, served in World War II, but was killed in action on the 14th of April 1943 at Algiers in Algeria. In November 1939, an article stated Mr Wesley Hall's daughter lends historic home. Mrs Gerard Tharp, who was Miss Dora Wesley Hall, has lent her historic home in Cambridgeshire. It has belonged to the Tharp family for generations as a maternity home for evacuated women. Already 14 babies have made their debut. Lord Killernan, Mrs Tharp's eldest son by her first husband, the Honorary George Morris, who was killed at Mons, has joined the Queen's Westminsters. He is an assistant adjutant. Mrs Tharp's second boy, John, aged 17, is still at Eton for his last half, and he too will probably follow in the footsteps of his father, the late Major Tharp. Mrs Tharp is working hard as a country councillor and JP. She is a county organiser for Women's Voluntary Services with an office in Cambridge and has a Red Cross mission under her where during the last year 4 detachments of first aid workers were trained. In addition to these public services, Mrs Tharp has to look after the estate and the farm as her agent, a naval reservist, has been released for duty. And on the 6th of May 1948, it announces that Mrs Gerard Tharp, second daughter of Mrs James Wesley Hall of Melbourne, died yesterday. She was the widow of Lieutenant Colonel Gerard Tharp, her first husband, Lieutenant Colonel Morris, the second son of Lord Killernan, who was killed in World War I. And his third daughter, Florence Mildred Georgina Canning Hall, known as Georgina, was born in London on the 15th of November 1894. On the 15th of July 1916, it announces the engagement of Miss Georgina Wesley Hall, youngest daughter of James Wesley Hall of Melbourne, to Captain Charles Edward Dunscombe Bridge, son of Brigadier General C.H. Bridge of Reading, England, and nephew of Admiral Sir Cyprian Bridge. Captain Bridge has distinguished himself in the present war and is being decorated by the King of the Belgians. And then on the 9th of December 1916, the announcement of the marriage at St Martin's in the Fields on Tuesday, the 10th of October, Captain Charles Bridge, only son of Brigadier General Sir Charles and Lady Bridge of Billinaboy Reading, was married to Miss Wesley Hall, daughter of the late Mr James Wesley Hall of Melbourne, and Mrs Wesley Hall of Chapel Street, Belgrave Square. The bride was given away by her uncle, Colonel F. Dawson. Charles and Georgina had 3 children. Georgina went to Kenya in 1948 and then on a cruise from Mozambique to London in 1954. Georgina died on the 28th of April 1970 in London, aged 75. Another brother of Walter Russell Hall was Albert Henry Hall, who was born on the 21st of November 1840 at Kingston, Herefordshire, England. He married Louisa Sarah Wigan on the 6th of November 1873 at Portishead, Somerset, England, when he was 32 and Louisa 18. Louisa had been born in Australia and they must have come back to Australia not long after their marriage, as they had their 2 children in Burwood, New South Wales. Unfortunately, neither survived childhood. There is an announcement of their daughter Margaret May's death at Rowland Cottage, Petersham, at the age of 4.5 months. And Albert died on the 11th of August 1875 in Concord, New South Wales, aged only 34. Another brother, Frederick Baines Hall, was born on the 22nd of February 1842 at Prestine, Herefordshire, England. He came out to Australia like his brothers did, and on the 31st of October 1876, it mentions that he was in a partnership in a business as seedsmen and general merchants, and the business name was Anderson Hall and Company, and it's stating here that there is going to be a dissolution of the partnership, and Mr. George Anderson has announced that. Frederick married Helena Isa Jane Patterson in Rockhampton, Queensland in 1885 when he was 43 and Helena 25. In the Rockhampton Bulletin on the 9th of July 1892, it has Rockhampton Police Court details, and it says, before the acting police magistrate, James Grant Patterson was charged on the information of Frederick Baines Hall that he, on the 14th of June at North Rockhampton, declared and threatened him by pointing at and firing a revolver loaded with gunpowder and shot at the said Frederick Baines Hall, and Frederick Baines Hall was afraid that James Grant Patterson would do him bodily injury, and Frederick is asking for James Grant Patterson to be required to find sureties to keep the peace. Mr. Patterson said his client intended to submit to any order the bench would make, and the judge placed a £10 surety to keep the peace for 6 months. Now, James Grant Patterson was actually William's brother-in-law, and it doesn't go through the reasoning as to why that altercation to that level took place. And of course, James's father was also one of the shareholders of the original Mount Morgan Mining Company, so the families would have been quite close. However, on the 19th of September 1896, there is an announcement in the Rockhampton newspaper to all of whom it may concern, whereas proof has been made to me, being a police magistrate of the licensing district of Rockhampton, Frederick Baines Hall, in consequence of excessive use of liquor, injures and endangers his health, and I do by this order forbid all licensees and dealers in liquor under the Act and all other persons within the district, prohibit them to give, sell or supply liquor to Frederick Baines Hall for the term of 12 calendar months. And then on the 2nd of September 1905, in the Supreme Court of Queensland, Rockhampton, in the matter of Frederick Baines Hall, lately of Rockhampton, but at present a patient in the hospital for the insane at Goodna, the creditors of the above-named Frederick Baines Hall are requested to send in proofs of their debts to the undersigned before the 8th of October 1905. So it's quite possible that Frederick's alcoholism has now caused mental health issues. Frederick died on the 9th of February 1932 in Queensland. It doesn't state where in Queensland, so I'm unsure whether he did remain in Goodna. Frederick and Helena had 5 children, 4 of whom survived into adulthood. One son moved to Ohio, USA, and the other 3 lived in Australia, but I did notice that they all at least made one trip to London as adults. And the last sibling is Charles Cobden Hall, who was born on the 4th of March 1845 at Kington in Herefordshire, England, and he died on the 17th of November 1877 at Rockhampton, and he was only 32. He did not marry. So with such a large family of siblings, some of them did extremely well and ended up having their children marry into some very notable and influential families. However, with all families, not everybody turns out as expected, and they also had their difficulties with some of Walter's siblings. So a man that came from very little and ended up being a very wealthy man who bestowed good on others. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.